Great. Thanks, David. I appreciate that. And yeah, I should point out, like past chair of 1159, if it makes a difference, but a great committee about monitoring power quality. Yeah, so the special assignment I've got right now, I'm currently serving as our executive director of the of Clemson's Dominion Energy Innovation Center down in Charleston, where we have our large wind turbine drivetrain test facility and our large electric grid emulator. So I've been involved with that for a number of years, and currently mostly doing that full time and a little teaching and research on the side. But anyway, so welcome everybody to the lunchtime session, so unfortunate we can't be here together and enjoy lunch together. But you know, in reflecting on this, some big advantages to this. You know, you can dress how you want. You can be as messy as you want. You don't have to worry about passing the salad dressing and spilling it on your neighbor. Making noise. You can get up and get coffee or tea and won't disturb anybody. But one difference is if the food is bad, you can't blame us and you can only blame yourself. So anyway, but understand we also have some attendees from outside the Carolinas, and we heard from the last session, in fact, from Texas and so forth, but maybe around the world. So if it's not lunchtime for you, enjoy your breakfast or dinner or happy hour or midnight snack, whatever's going on. So we're glad you're here. So our session here is titled Beyond the Generation Portfolio, Our Evolving Infrastructure and Evolving Grids. And, you know, it goes without saying to the folks that are here today that this is an unprecedented time in many ways. But in the grid side, you know, with rapidly evolving technology in all aspects of the electricity sector. And, you know, I've never seen a definitive document that talks about the pace of change that's going on right now in the electric energy sector. But certainly, I can't think that it's ever evolved this fast. It's really, you know, of course, stimulating and exciting, and engineers are always creating challenges, fixing things or solving problems to create new problems, and that's always so neat. But so we're going to be looking in this panel session about how we integrate all this generation that we just talked about in the previous segment into our legacy grid. And one that thought-provokingly this morning, Michael Young mentioned, you know, that we started with renewables, carbon-free microgrids, and you know, here we are again. So interesting how these things come full circle sometimes. So it's an amazing time in our industry, and an amazing time as all this grid modernization discussion has become a really big hot topic. So this is the focus. I have the good fortune of having three distinguished panelists today, experts in their areas. Cristin, Lyons, Anuja, Ratnayake, and Charlie Bayless. I'll introduce those guys in just a moment. Just like Mike started off the previous session, let me just throw out a few ground rules here and how we're going to operate this panel. Unlike the previous one, we are not going to have slides unless one of my panelists is going to surprise me. But anyway, this is going to be a conversation style panel. So remember, it's lunchtime entertainment, so you can listen and concentrate on eating and don't have to look at slides. So questions from everyone are fair game. I can ask, the panelists can ask each other, the panelists can ask themselves, and they can ask questions, in fact, that they wish they had been asked that weren't asked. So that's fine. And the audience, of course, can ask questions. We'll use the chat just like was used previously, that Mike moderated, and that seemed to work really well. And I noticed the panelists were even in the previous session looking at the chat and sort of answering things that they saw come up, and that's perfectly fine too. And you know, I guess if all else fails, we could also have the panelists ask audience members, but we probably won't have time for that. So interaction is encouraged, and please use the chat feature as we go. So let me give a super quick introduction of who's on the panel, and then I'll kick us off by asking the first question. So we've got Anuja Ratnayake, who's the Director of Market Strategy from Duke Energy. She's been with Duke for 16 years and over the past decade has led strategic initiatives focused on integration planning, innovation, and distributed resource strategy. She holds an undergraduate degree from Berea College, a master's in business administration and international diplomacy from the University of Kentucky, and has studied behavioral economics at Harvard's executive program. Charlie Bayless comes to us from North Carolina's electric cooperatives. He's the vice president and senior regulatory counsel, and he served in that capacity since 2010. Previously, he served as counsel to AEP in Ohio, and he holds a degree in economics from the Virginia Military Institute, master's degree in operations from the University of Arkansas, and an MBA from the University of Arizona, and a law degree from West Virginia College of Law. And then finally, Cristin Lyons is a partner and the energy practice leader with ScottMadden, and she leads the firm's energy practice. She's been with the firm since 1999 and has consulted with a myriad of clients on issues ranging from process and organizational redesign to merger integration. She has a BA in political science and Spanish from Gettysburg College and an MBA from the Cox School of Business at SMU. And more details about their backgrounds are available in the packet that E4 Carolina supply. So that was a quick introduction. And I'll go ahead and get this kicked off by posing the first question to Cristin, and she can help to start us by framing up the conversation. So in addition to the generation mix that we talked about in the previous segment, what things do you think will be required to meet the ambitious climate goals that we're facing?
Thanks, Randy. It's good to be with you all this afternoon. And even before I jump into that, something occurred to me as you were providing your opening remarks, is that regarding the amount of change that we're seeing across the industry right now.
Right.
And at least in the decades that I've been in this industry, we've typically seen a lot of churn in one aspect of it. You know, if you remember the big gas expansion in the generation side years ago, then we moved over to transmission because that had been underinvested in. And then gradually we moved in the last decade or so to focus more on distribution and DERs coming onto the system. And I think where we are today and why it feels so dramatic in terms of change is that type of transformation is happening across the entire energy sector. And we haven't seen all of those things happen concurrently before.
Yeah.
So
interesting point.
I'll start off by framing the question, and the last panel may well have talked about this as well. But if we think about the commitments made to date to achieve 100% clean or net zero energy by states and utilities only, that today equals roughly 40% of 2018 retail load. So going forward, 40% of our retail load is already committed to these goals in the 2050 timeframe, which is pretty astounding when we think about the magnitude of those targets. And importantly, it doesn't count things like the commitments made by the Googles and the Apples and the Amazons of the world, which are really shifting the equation as well. So I think it's well understood that that means a lot of change on the generation side of the equation. I think what people are coming to realize is that the changes to the grid cannot be incremental if we're going to meet the targets that have been put out there for 2050. In the early 2000s, transmission got a tremendous amount of focus for mainly reliability and resiliency reasons. In recent years, transmission has again started to come, and I'd say just in the last year or so, transmission again is front and center because people are beginning to realize that if the initial targets are in 2030, you need to start building transmission today because it typically takes 10 or more years to build greenfield. At the same time, there's been uncertainty out of FERC related to both base ROEs and transmission incentives. So at a time when we arguably need a tremendous amount of investment, the financial mechanisms are moving on that side. We're also, no doubt this panel is going to talk a lot about the distribution system, but we have seen a lot of focus on the distribution system and integrating distributed energy resources, energy efficiency, demand management, and the like. And I'm sure we'll come back to that, but hopefully that gets us started. Thanks, Randy.
Great. Thanks, Cristin. Excellent comments. So next, we'll turn it over to Anuja, and this is similar to a discussion we heard this morning about the carbon commitment. So Duke Energy has made a public commitment to reduce carbon. Beyond the generation portfolio that we talked about in the previous session, what's this going to take to meet those commitments?
Thanks, Randy. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Can you all hear me? Okay, good.
An excellent background.
Cristin did a great job laying the groundwork for everything I have here and introducing all of the right elements in her response. So from where we sit, we think of three pillars supporting our commitment to carbon neutrality in the long term and our commitment to the North Carolina clean energy goals in the short term. First of these pillars is the flexible grid design. What this really means is moving from our one-way power flow network to a networked model. So think of distribution looking more and more like the transmission networks we have today. What this does is it allows us to have contingency built in by design. It allows for faster grid response times to variability introduced by the distribution tied resources, because we will now have multiple restoration paths. You've seen this concept introduced from Duke under the term self-healing grids. In addition to that, within flexible design, we are also looking at things like microgrids. So customers who need higher reliability but have their own clean energy goals, for example, can have the option to meet their reliability and clean energy goals through forms of microgrids. Then moving on to the transmission grid. The transmission grid is also updating to enable more variable generation. Medium and low voltage power electronics is a really good example here. So things like SVCs and fax devices. What these offer us is the ability for the transmission grid to accommodate backflow and therefore enable more and more distribution-tied renewables. Then moving on to the second pillar. The second pillar is the emerging grid technologies that offer flexible reliability. So I've worked on energy storage since 2007. I've seen the advancements both from technology side, but also from the commercial viability side for energy storage solutions over that 1.5 decades. I think it's finally ready for our industry and our high standards of asset reliability that we essentially ascribe to all of our assets. And you're going to see this coming in through more and more utility plans over the next months and years. You're also seeing how utilities have expanded our planning processes to capture the rich amount of value from solutions like distribution-tied energy storage. Many of you are hopefully already familiar with our integrated system operations planning effort. That effort was brought forward because of solutions like distribution-tied energy storage that has value beyond normal distribution asset. Then the third pillar for us is demand-side resources that are enabled by new rate designs and emerging technologies. This one has lots of nuances to it. On one side, we are all familiar with the traditional energy efficiency and DR concepts. In fact, Duke was recognized earlier this year by the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy as the leader in the Southeast for our energy efficiency portfolio. But we are recognizing that the changing world around us, as our generation portfolio and our grid design approach changes, our practice of ascribing value to demand-side resources also need to evolve. We've recognized this, and Duke is obviously committed to this. In fact, you may have noticed we brought in a national-level leader in design to lead this effort. Lon Huber, he used to be in Navigant previously. So here in the short term, you're going to see more and more details coming out about how we are thinking about these novel designs that would continue to capture the total value of demand-side resources. The second nuance I do want to point out before I move on from the third pillar here is customer preferences and emerging technology trends create sort of the other side of the demand-side resource coin, right? Everything from residential heat pumps and water heaters that contribute well over 1/3 of our winter peak, as well as CNI lighting, that is one of the second largest contributors to our winter peak. They're all seeing advancements from a technology evolution point of view, business model adoption point of view. So our ability to integrate these technology evolutions effectively is what will solidify our success with this third pillar. And I'll stop there and answer questions as things come up.
Great. Thanks, Anuja. Excellent comments. Let me move on then to Charlie Bayless. Charlie, this morning we heard from Michael Young that the NCEMC is undertaking a number of energy storage and microgrid projects. Can you give us some more information about these projects that you're undertaking and how these projects impact the grid and infrastructure?
Sure. NCEMC's work on renewables really dates back about 8 years to our 18 community solar sites that we began. But more recently, NCEMC has undertaken the beginnings of several solar plus storage sites. We're currently in the first tranche of these sites, and these our current first tranche is about 10 megawatts of solar and 20 megawatt hours of storage. It's going to vary all the way down from the smallest site being about half a megawatt of solar and 1 megawatt hour of storage, up to 5 megawatts of solar and 10 megawatt hours of storage. We plan to have this first tranche done around the end of this year. May bleed a little into next year, but sometime around the end of this year, we plan to have these first sites of solar plus storage operational. And we've already started looking at tranche 2 and taking some ideas for tranche 3, both of which will be the same approximate size of 10 megawatts of solar and 20 megawatt hours of storage. So NCEMC plans to be building these solar plus storage facilities throughout the state in the upcoming years. And for those of you that are unfamiliar with cooperatives, there's 26 distribution cooperatives in the state, and they operate in 93 of the 100 counties, which is about 45% of the landmass of the state. So when I talk about these solar plus storage facilities, they're really going to be located throughout the state, in distribution co-ops, service territories throughout the state, where those 26 operate. Now, in addition to the solar plus storage, NCEMC also has several microgrid projects that we've undertaken. The first of these is an NCEMC-owned microgrid project on Ocracoke Island. This one has solar plus storage. It has a diesel generator, but it also incorporates web or wireless connected thermostats and water heaters for demand response in houses on Ocracoke Island. And this microgrid really helps improve the reliability on the island, and because it's at the end of a very long radial line, it helps with alleviating demand during system peak. It helps that reliability out there at the end of the line on the island. Another microgrid that NCMC has is a partnership. We've got a few partnerships going on that I'll talk about, but this one's between NCMC and a Butler Farms, which is a hog farm in central North Carolina. And this one, again, has solar plus storage. And it also has a biogas generator that uses the biogas from the hog waste. And this microgrid helps improve the reliability of the farm and also helps the farm attain its sustainability goals. But this has the capability of actually being islanded. So during an outage, the farm plus a small number of houses that are surrounding the farm can actually be islanded and served off the microgrid for a period of time during an outage in the area for recovery after a storm or something like that. Now, a third microgrid is still in the development process. These past two have been operational for 2 or 3 years now. The third one we're developing is with a company called Roseacre Farm, and they are an egg farm. This one's going to be bigger than the other two. It has a 2 megawatts of solar and 4 megawatts of storage. In CMC and the distribution co-op, in this case, Tideland EMC, were approached by Roseacre Farm to help achieve their sustainability goals and help reliability on the farm. So all three parties working together came up with this microgrid that we are developing on our Roseacre Farm and will hopefully be operational in about a year. In addition to the microgrids, NCMC is also partnering, along with the distribution co-ops, with a number of home builders to develop resilient communities. And these communities will offer things such as solar and storage. They might be centralized solar and storage, or some of the communities will have it in the individual houses. Generators, EV chargers, and these are aimed to help with the resiliency and sustainability of the communities. Some of them are being, have that extra selling point of sustainability and resiliency. And finally, NCMC is developing a distribution operator platform. The co-ops in North Carolina have hundreds of megawatts of DER on their system. About a year ago, it was 400 megawatts, but I'm sure it's increased since that time. But as the DER devices and resources continue to move to the distribution grid, it's important to identify these devices and set up communications with DER so we know exactly what's there and sort of the operations of the DER devices, how much output there is, and how the device is performing. And this will help, the DEO is really helping with the operation reliability in interacting upstream with the transmission owner. And the plan for the DEO platform is to allow higher levels of DER. If we know what's on the distribution line and how it's operating, we can better optimize that line for higher levels of DER and have higher levels of DER on the system. It's going to increase reliability and hopefully provide some upstream value, which could defer new investment in transmission or generation.
Great. Thank you, Charlie. Excellent information and intriguing projects. Let me follow up with a question that I'm going to put out there that Anuja mentioned a moment ago, and see if we can tie these together. So these projects that you've got, you mentioned Ocracoke Island, for example, is one, and in others where you're putting energy solar plus storage and things like this out on the distribution network, but there's a need for that distribution network to be configured properly to be able to do things like islanding. You mentioned that in one of the projects and so forth. So what kinds of changes have you made on your distribution system to enable these projects to go forward? And where do you see this going in the future?
Well, really, that's what the distribution operator platform we're developing is supposed to handle. As we see more of the distribution on the grid, we're finding that a lot of it never leaves the grid. The old system was sort of generation through transmission to the distribution system. And now there's the distribution system, instead of being a sink or a load, is really a resource. Generation is on the grid and it serves the grid and never really leaves the grid through the transmission system. So we are having to devise these systems, and the distribution operator is that sort of platform to help reliability. But as part of that, we really need communications, and the co-ops are looking at things such as the implementation of IEEE 1547, which is supposed to standardize the communications between devices and the distribution operator, which will, a standardized platform for communications should lower the cost for everyone. Everyone has just one basic platform. They communicate easier. And this will hopefully allow increased DER penetration on the system. Once, we get the distribution operator up and running, we can see what's there and configure the distribution grid, to accommodate those. But it is taking increased communications, automation of systems and things like that, which the co-ops are currently in the process of installing in the grid.
Okay, helpful. And so to pivot over to the comment that Cristin made earlier about transmission, then, Cristin, how do you balance? I thought that was a great comment you made earlier about this acceleration in so many areas across the entire sector, not just in one particular bucket. So you mentioned earlier about transmission. So while we've got all these things happening in distribution, as Charlie and Anuja mentioned, can you talk a little more about transmission?
Sure. So I think one of the challenges that the industry as a whole is facing is, where do you put your chips? And what's going to give you the biggest bang for the buck as you look at these 2050 goals that a lot of companies and states have put out there? When you talk about big incremental shifts in the generation mix, they are largely going to come from the utility scale side, whether that's gas plants, nuclear, or renewables. So the role of transmission is critical because typically renewables don't sit close to load. So you have at a minimum the need to build interstate transmission, and often a lot of intrastate transmission as well. So again, that refers back to FERC policy and where FERC is headed in terms of the financial interests of the parties that are developing that transmission. But I think at the same time, for a state that's looking to meet these goals and incorporate, demand management alternatives, as Anuja was talking about, energy efficiency, distributed resources to the extent that they can also help move the needle, the question then becomes, how do we balance investment in the high voltage infrastructure and the returns that we get, how we make money, with what's needed to support actually myriad goals in the distribution system? Because distribution investments that we're seeing today, they support a flexible grid, but we're seeing them also deploy reliability, resilience, customer engagement, customer information, And again, how do you create a portfolio of investments that both advances your goals toward 2050 and provides customers some of these newish ideas that they're interested in? So depending upon the customer, those goals are going to be different. You know, a Google or an Amazon are going to want 100% clean energy. A residential customer may just want to know how much energy they've consumed this week, which an industrial customer already knows. So I think it's a balancing act where the regulatory construct matters a lot, and the ability of companies like Duke, the cooperatives, to create a pathway that satisfies myriad goals. It's very hard.
Yeah, and it's very hard and also so matrixed. How do you have centralized leadership that's driving these myriad, right? So yeah, completely agree. Anuja, do you have any comments on that? Because I think actually your pillars that you mentioned earlier, touch broadly on several of those topics.
Right, I'm not sure I have a whole lot to add. Cristin said it so well. I think at the end of the day, we are at the cusp of change in our industry, or maybe we've passed the cusp because we've been at the cusp probably for a good 5 to 7 years. But really, the path forward is not going to be defined by a single entity. It's all of us working together. We've done really well in the past, not still working together, but we had clear direction as to how to make decisions on what becomes our generation portfolio investments, what become our grid investments, and so on. What's changing to me is the world is changing because our customers are changing and technology is changing. So the needs are changing, and there are ways to accommodate those needs that need to be thought beyond discussed. And all of us need to come together to understand what is that path forward. So then, I don't know, I'm adding a whole lot. Cristin said it so well.
Okay.
Well, I think Anuja said something really important, is that there needs to be a path laid out. And I think many of the utilities and cooperatives that have come out and made commitments that are bold and have even gone so far as to say, we may not know what the technology is to fill that wedge just yet. Putting a target out there for where we want to be then allows stakeholders to start to align around something. You know, if the target is to clean energy by 2050, then it's a matter of what is the most cost-effective way to get there, as opposed to what's the right technology and mine wins over yours. So that putting those ambitious goals out there, I believe, are very important for where we are in the industry right now.
Randy, well, I was going to say, I think that, one of the things to consider, like Cristin said, there are so many different variables out there, but when you think about planning transmission for the future, and you look at load, I think it used to be that you just planned for the peak load, and that was the calculation. And I don't think that sort of planning process can occur anymore, because there are so many resources on the distribution system that now if you plan for peak load, you're probably overbuilding transmission and generation, because a lot of that, some portion of that load, it's going to depend by area. Some will be very small, some will be considerable. Maybe we have co-ops that have 40% of their peak load in distribution system or DER on their systems. So when you start planning for absolute peak load, I think you have to account for DER that's on the system, or you're going to end up overbuilding things like transmission and generation.
So I'll add on to what Charlie said. I think one of the things that's been absolutely fascinating when I first went to do integrated resource planning was looking at planning from the perspective of serving the society we serve within a jurisdiction. We plan for the entire jurisdiction. But then what's changing about customer preferences as well as the technology evolution, what that very immediately made obvious was a point that Charlie was making there, which is locational investments are driving where there is need for investment versus that societal view we've had. And recognizing that in our planning process is incredibly important, because the concentration of distribution tied generating resources and the concentration of load centers, that changes the type of investment that's necessary on the grid side. It also changes the way we think about solving the needs of our constituency, right? So that locational aspect coming into our planning is one of the biggest things that we have to do correctly and think of the right incentives to enable that correctly. That's probably one of the biggest things that in our generation we need to get right in order to make sure the communities we serve get the best benefit out of all we are doing.
I would add that we've also added a temporal element. So there's location and time of day or year because of the way the assets that are now being integrated behave, depending upon whether it's dark out or it's spring.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one of the big changes, and I guess storage, of course, is plays a big role in that. Cristin, we had a question pop in for you, but of course it would be all panelists can address this in turn. But are there some examples that you can point to from other states where transmission and distribution system upgrades were undertaken to address this temporal aspect that you just discussed, as part of a state net zero or 100% clean goal?
Well, I think to date, where we've seen these types of planning studies focus has been on areas where there's been an influx primarily of solar. And the ISO or state planning authority, whether that's a utility or another party, has had to figure out, holy cow, how are we going to incorporate all of that into forecasting that we're doing? So in New England, they have made a tremendous amount of progress because of the large influx of solar, primarily in Massachusetts, in terms of their forecasts, which of course is the entry point to planning for the upgrades that the system needs. So ISO New England has done some really good work there.
Good. Anyone else have anything to add from experience? Okay, good.
Yeah.
Well, thanks, Cristin. Yep.
At a place where they've had to incorporate these large-scale renewables, California has done tremendous work in the planning aspect. I remember the days when we believed the 10% wind was going to crash the transmission system. And, we are well beyond that in many parts of the country.
Right. No doubt about that. Great. So, speaking of wind, I have a question that Catherine Collins mentioned in the previous session. You showed those images of how tall towers would have the potential to access some wind resources that don't exist down on the surface in the Carolinas, and intriguing to think about how tall these things could possibly be. And so I'd like to know what the panel thinks about wind, both onshore and offshore, as part of the generation mix, and what the grid and infrastructure would need to look like in order to integrate and operate those sources, and what you think the challenges are involved with that. Anybody want to take that?
Sure, I'll get started. I would love to actually hear Cristin's perspective as somebody who is not operating the grid but is advising us. From where we sit, I think particularly the offshore wind presentation in the previous discussion was really intriguing. The offshore wind portion of the previous discussion was really intriguing beyond purchasing from elsewhere and sort of onshore portion. the part that I've been following and struggling with a little bit is everywhere offshore wind has taken off, policy has supported it immensely. And I think Virginia was the latest that we saw. The previous panel spoke to it. When I look at our Carolinas coastline, there is such high potential for us from the offshore point of view. But I'm intrigued to understand if within the community of folks who are on this call today, do we truly have that appetite for something like offshore wind industry to take off? So I'm not sure I'm necessarily answering your question, Randy, but from where I sit, I think the potential is huge for us to benefit from a renewable resource that not only is renewable, but also complements our current portfolio that we are building, right? So like when you look at the profile of offshore wind production to the profile of solar production, which is our largest renewable asset right now, is complementing. It doesn't come at the same time. One comes when the other one's, right? From that sense, from where I sit, I look at it and go, oh my God, from an operator point of view, this seems like a God-given. We should totally get behind it. Then I put my economics hat and I go, yeah, well, economics-wise, this is not going to make any least cost planning criteria for a good long while, like until 2040, if we take the best case scenarios. What that means is the regions that have adopted or enabled offshore wind has done that by through many policy mechanisms. And I'd love to understand the rest of the panelists' view on, do we think we have the appetite to make that happen in Carolinas?
Charlie or Cristin?
Yeah, I from my perspective, it largely comes down to reliability and cost. And I think that, as Anuja was saying, that when you look at the sort of complementary perspectives, right now you have generation that's, has a high capacity factor, is available, pretty much all the time. So trying to figure out how to mimic that at the cheapest cost possible. Is it, wind and solar that complement each other with the little batteries? Is it wind from the west and wind from the east that may be going, blowing at different times of the day? That sort of brings up that, overall capacity factor to achieve the goal of providing reliable electricity at a reasonable cost. So I think sort of all forms of renewables fit in, but you have to figure out how to pair them together and add some storage to get the sort of desired outcome, the 24/7 electricity at the most reasonable cost is sort of how I look at it.
Yeah, both Anuja and Charlie said something that was really important, and that is, to the extent that policy is going to drive us to something other than the least cost solution, we need to be very intentional and transparent about that as an industry, because not all customers are created equal. And I think we're living in a world right now where utility uncollectibles are increasing daily. We're looking at proceedings that are going to address that over time, which is going to add to customer bills, which it may well be the right thing to do for everyone, but it has a cost to it. Energy efficiency programs are continuing. That's a cost that goes on the customer bill. And as we create this portfolio, the true costs and benefits of both the entire portfolio and those discrete investments need to be very clear. And offshore wind is a case where, as was said, on the face of it, the economics don't work today. If it's the right answer in light of a portfolio of resources that reach net zero by 2050, and the state has decided, yes, that makes sense, customers can vote in the next election on whether that's the right answer for them. I can't speak specifically to the Carolinas, but some of the chats are suggesting that we love wind here.
Yeah, there's several we love wins in there, so no negatives. Good. Thanks, everyone. Yeah, and speaking of audience participation, we love to get your questions and comments. So feel free to, between bites of dessert now, send us a question or a comment if you have one in the chat. So, Cristin, it's been mentioned a couple of times now. I think you just touched on it a second ago. What role in all of this, with grid modernization and so forth, do things like the energy efficiency and demand response and so forth? What role do those play in all this?
Well, actually, I think Anuja started the conversation about demand response and energy efficiency. So the megawatt or the kilowatt hour that you don't use, of course, is the best option as we go forward. I mean, and energy efficiency programs have been in place since the 70s.
Yeah.
So as we consider how to build out this portfolio of resources, I think we need to think about it a couple of ways. First, if estimates for electrification are correct today, by 2050, in addition to all the clean energy mandates that are showing up, we could have a 50% increase in electric load. A lot of that's going to come out of the gas system, again, if some of the current projections hold. So as we think about that becoming a much cleaner portfolio, but a much larger, first, the ability to meet a 50% increase in load through energy efficiency and demand management is likely to be limited. The other piece is that as we add more and more clean, cheap resources into the resource mix, the cost test that utilities typically use for energy efficiency programs is going to look very different, because the next megawatt will not compare as favorably to that stack. So we may well see, and California has started to see this already, a reduction in energy efficiency programs, given how clean and efficient or economically efficient that set of resources is today.
Yeah, great. Anuja, any follow up to that?
Sorry, Randy, I don't think I can top what Cristin said. She said it so well.
Okay, perfect. No problem. But we had another question come in, and it has to do with the do we have the appetite for some of this, and do we really want these things in our backyard? The NIMBY principle, I guess. So the question started with the comment that no one wants a transmission line in their backyard, and network congestion causes energy price instability in regions like Texas, which are impacting financing opportunities for wind farms and other generation assets. And this also impacts the Southeast's ability to import wind. Can any of you talk about promising solutions emerging in this area? And then the closing question was, will we need cheaper underground transmission?
Well, I think cheaper underground transmission would be brilliant. I'm not sure we in the office today.
I was going to say cheap and underground, I'm not sure goes hand in hand. What I was thinking when I saw the question there was less of a technology solution, but more of, and to me, this is part of the overall mix that we have to balance as we look forward. There are some things that technology has enabled us to do so much better, but some things we just have to rethink how we use our existing footprints, our existing assets. So the way we are thinking about this is there a way that we can leverage our existing transmission right-of-ways, for example, to expand the capacity of the transmission lines instead of looking for new transmission right-of-ways, which brings this not in my backyard problem. And Duke has, you guys have all read about our trials and tribulations trying to site new transmission. So I don't know whether my answer is truly that silver bullet we are looking for, because I'm still struggling with cheap and underground together. But other than that, I think for us, like thinking more creatively about leveraging our existing assets, our existing right-of-ways is perhaps at least a short-term approach.
Yeah, I would concur. In addition, we have the opportunity to think more broadly about the right-of-ways that exist in society as a whole. FERC actually just did a study on the use of non-transmission corridors like railways, highways for purposes of building high voltage transmission. Some have chosen to go underground, HVDC, bypassing rivers and the like. And there's some interesting work going on there. I have to comment on the fact that congestion causes energy price instability in regions like Texas. That actually points to the need for more transmission. And Texas, for many years, has been a great example of what can happen if you build the transmission first to enable the resources in West Texas. Granted, the right-of-way issues in West Texas were somewhat less than they are in maybe Raleigh, North Carolina.
I think one of the things I've seen is, possibly locating new wind or solar near a closing plant. So if you had a gas combined cycle plant that was closing, there's already an existing interconnection there. It doesn't always work. There may be no wind that blows there, so it's a bad place for wind. But sometimes those sites work out and, provide an opportunity to have an interconnection to the transmission system that already exists, which is a way to, cheaply interconnect. And I think we've heard, undergrounding and cheap are mutually exclusive, I think. One other aspect of undergrounding is it usually has a much considerably longer restoration time, where an overhead line can be restored in hours or a day or two. Undergrounding lines, sometimes take weeks to restore. If you have to, do digging and relaying cable and things like that. So there can be prolonged outages dealing with underground lines.
Great.
Really good approach, per se, which is, I know the question was posed within the context of how can we introduce more wind, whether they be offshore or onshore. But like if you look at Duke's Western North Carolina effort, our original proposal included building large transmission. Our customers were very forthright and transparent about telling us how much they did not appreciate that. So our approach was to then think about how do we bring local generation where we could eliminate the transmission. And I think that's part of the solution. And I think that's part of what Charlie was also referring to, finding the local generation resources that enable us to eliminate some of the transmission need has to be part of the solution. It may not enable us to get offshore wind to the right communities, but in this case, transmission can be a true showstopper for some of this.
Yep. Great. And we're getting a series of questions that are coming in, and I'm looking at the clock. So, and David will reach over and snatch us if we run over. So let me ask two, kind of combine a couple of questions here that we've got. One has to ask: could an regional transmission organization in the Southeast help improve interconnectivity issues across the region and provide balancing options with wind resources that are in the Midwest and in solar that we have, especially in the North Carolina, but in the Southeast?
I could crack at least part of that.
Okay.
So one of the big challenges in terms of building transmission is actually interregional transmission, because even across RTOs, they have different cost-benefit criteria for public policy projects. And for an interregional project to meet both sets of criteria is often near impossible. So that's actually one of the failures of Order 1000 that we've seen, which was introduced competition and a lot of planning processes into the RTOs. But that interregional piece, in my personal view, has been left unaddressed. So an RTO actually wouldn't solve that problem.
Okay, great. Thanks. And then a final question, we'll probably have to wrap it up at this point, was will residential solar and other distributed energy sources, do you think that'll be significant enough in the future to actually reduce the need for transmission? I mean, we talked about that. It seems an interesting view based on what you said earlier, Cristin, but just in redesign the distribution network. I don't know if you see the question in the chat, but any thoughts about that from any of the panelists?
Cristin, do you want to take it first? I'm good.
Go ahead.
So I would say a resounding yes, but the only caveat is timing on this one. The interregional transmission Cristin talked about perhaps is not it is not what I'm talking about when I say I defer transmission, right? It is within our region. If I can bring generation closer to the load center, then intuitively you understand why we would be able to reduce transmission. In the good old days, we built transmission because load and generation lived in two different places and I needed a way to connect them. But in this future state where if I can bring my generation closer to my load center, then I can definitely reduce the new transmission additions. The interesting nuance there, however, is how do I balance my clean energy goals? How do I balance my reliability goals? And how do I balance my least cost planning goals? Like when I put all of these things together, the answer may not necessarily be immediately putting generation sources or a single type of renewable generation source close to the load center. If I do that, my likelihood of giving up on reliability is high, right? So it's a balancing act. But by itself, if that question was asked, I would say absolutely. If I can put distributed generation next to the load center, then I don't necessarily have a need for expanded transmission.
I couldn't agree more.
I'll just leave it with I agree.
All right. Well, we have approached just seconds before 1 o'clock. So I see David hovering out there, grinning. Jess is probably back there ready to push the button. So let me thank our extraordinary panel, Anuja and Charlie and Cristin, for their great comments and the audience participation. It's been a fun session. I hope you enjoyed your lunch, and I look forward to having mine when we're finished. So anyway, David, I'll turn it back over to you, and thanks again to our panel.
Thanks, Randy.